This is Stella Tsantekidou from Left on Red Media, and this is Bread and Roses, the political podcast for the aesthetically and intellectually curious. Today, I have Chris Worrall with me, who will be talking to me about housing policy and reforms boomerocracy. Hello, Chris. So, you are chair of Poplar and Limehouse CLP, that's Constituency Labour Party. You are also one of the co-founders and an organizer with the Labour Yimbys. And you love housing, you love planning, you have fights with all the NIMBYs on X every other day. And you're going to help me understand reforms policies and some of the items that have made it into the news about them lately. And the first thing I want to talk to you is there was this write-up in the Financial Times this week, which sent Yimbys absolutely mad, in which it was saying that senior figures around reform have been organizing to create a MAGA-style think tank like Turning Point USA. And they have been getting donors. And from what I understand, they want to have a conference as early as 2026 that will be like a reform-style Davos. I think they are taking this from ARC, which is the Jordan Peterson conference that I went a couple of months back representing Labour Yimby, which is the Alliance of Responsible Citizenship, which is basically a great way for right-wing organizations to get money from basically right-wing people who have a lot of money and they have specific pet causes that they want to promote. And people got very, very angry with it because one of the documents had the kind of policies that they want to be pursuing, and they were saying that all of the policy recommendations they are going to be data-driven, and it is part of the broader attempt to professionalize reform and make Nigel Farage ready to become prime minister. And their first campaign was going to be about countering house building. Now, this is not yet official policy for the Reform Party, but this is what the people who are funding them want to pursue in their first campaign at their first reform adjacent think tank. So why don't you talk to me a little bit about the housing policies that you've seen coming out of reform so far, the ones that the actual party has suggested they want to pursue?
Yeah, thanks, Stella. I'd say, it was interesting, the sort of backlash against what was an alleged leak in the press, to be sort of quickly rebuffed by Zia Yusuf, who claimed that you shouldn't believe everything you read and that wasn't their policy. However, I think, maybe the mask slipped before they even had time to put it on. Some of the policies that they put forward, can be seen as YIMBY adjacent with their sort of fast track planning permission, so loose fit planning. So very much a focus on urban regeneration. You can see where this is going rather than greenfield. But that matches the Labour Party's policy of brownfield first and green belt second. And they've had a subsequent grey belt re-evaluation. The second one that stands out is their sort of pro-landlord policies. They're talking about abolishing Section 21. Now, part of the Renters Reform Bill that the Labour Party has been pushing has been to increase and improve tenants' rights. Now, internationally, the UK's tenant protections are considered somewhat a lot weaker than other countries. So this would be a marked step. I think there is counterclaims that, particularly around Section 21, no-fault evictions, you've seen that, that's been a leading reason why people have pushed for reform in this. But there's arguments to say that this may just result in much more at-fault evictions. These are the things that can hit your credit rating. So there's a debate to be had there. And then the third one, which I think is probably the most interesting in the direction of travel, particularly around how immigration, or, particularly we've heard a lot of crimigation literature, so crime and immigration, may roll off the back of it, but mostly to do with their social housing policy, where they've said foreigners need to get to the back of the queue. So that's the start for 10 there, Stella.
This is very interesting. there is a problem with reform in that the majority of their voting base is older people. And obviously the majority of the voter base in the UK is pensioners, right? The boomers are the biggest voting bloc in the UK. And a lot of people will say this is why government so far has been prioritizing the interests of boomers. Who are by and large property owners. A lot of them have second and third properties, which they rent out to young working people. The demographics in the UK mean that there is a big chunk of young people who are actually immigrants, so they can't vote in the interests of younger people. But even for just the truest Brighton that even the most far right person would recognize in the UK would recognize as pure-blooded British, they too have not been served well by the policies of the last 15 years, and there is a concern that they wouldn't be served by Reform and Nigel Farage, because a lot of the people who are in senior positions at Reform, like Richard Tice, like Nigel Farage, like Rupert Lowe, who now has been expelled, they are landlords, and there is a lot of discontent among, we keep on saying, younger people are turning to the right, they're becoming more right-wing. That's true. But we haven't seen all of these young right-wingers turn to Reform yet. And I wonder whether you think that there is, in fact, cut-through with a lot of these people about what it would mean if, say, in the next elections, you had a coalition of chaos between the Conservatives and the Reform Party trying to keep their boomer voting base loyal.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we've discussed in private, haven't we, the boomerocracy, and there's a huge pivot towards that in any election. We've seen that with the triple lock, and you've written about that recently yourself. I think with regards to the sort of back of the queue situation, it's a policy so chilling, I'd say Enoch Powell's ghost might need a jumper. We're seeing a real pivot with immigration to be pushed front and centre into the housing debate. And, the Labour Party has taken, drastic action to a lot of people's, to some's upset and to many think it's in the right direction, tackling foreign criminals, the increasing deportation levels, improving our border security. But at the end of the day, what this is really facing the direction of travel in is how immigration comes into that debate, which is a key issue, across many age ranges. And we've seen with BBC interviewing some of these left behind communities how, TikTok is driving a lot of awareness of the Reform brand. But just to touch on that, I think the Reform social housing policy, and at least, is one that's exclusionary because it's putting foreigners at the back of the queue. Where we have seen immigration and housing collide on a bipartisan support is in Denmark. Now, Denmark had some policies that it described. It was originally introduced by a centre-right government under ghettos, or the ghettoisation of certain areas. And it was subsequently rebranded as one that was dubbed parallel societies after it met with some backlash. Now, the sort of driving ethos behind that was more around integration and inclusion, and that if areas are too closed off, too homogenous, they sometimes lack. Where am I going with that? Sorry, I'm going to edit that out. They sometimes lack issues around
community cohesion,
community cohesion, right? Exactly. And I think one of the main things that was said in the speech was that they talked about holes in Danish society. Now, what they've described is they wanted no ghettos by 2030, and this was originally put in place by a government that had far-right support with the Danish People's Party. And in 2008 or 10, it then materialised into Parliament in 2018 with 80% majority support on a bipartisan basis. And this is it was under a policy called Towards a Denmark Without Parallel Societies. Now, some of the policies in there which focus on inclusion, that has had bipartisan support, could be seen quite challenging for many on the left. So they looked at reducing non-profit housing to have a maximum of 40% of non-Western individuals or families. They were doing that through listing out what they called vulnerable areas. So either with a severe ghetto problem or a vulnerable area to ghettoisation. And what that meant is in practice, they were finding themselves with allegations of discrimination and challenges in the European Court of Justice over this when it comes to legal scrutiny over human rights. But in practice, what it meant was no more than 40% of an area by 2030 could be made up of immigrants or descendants of immigrants, particularly in what they call public housing. That involves demolishing, selling, redeveloping urban areas to encourage more diversity. So you can see the challenge there. They also took, with the criminalisation argument, a double punishment kind of role. So what that meant was, in certain areas, if you committed crimes in those areas, you would face penalties twice as severe. And they also added on top compulsory integration measures. So compulsory integration measures like mandatory daycare. So up from a year old, if you lived in a certain area, you would require 25 hours daycare to learn Danish values and the Danish language. And non-compliance would face welfare sanctions. And all in all, what these were set out to do was to eliminate parallel societies and to promote integration. So, we can see in contrast, reform haven't quite grasped the nettle, but I know from looking elsewhere, we've seen with some Swiss boarding schools, they have a maximum nationality of 10% because they found over the years that allowing going beyond following introduction of a nationality quota, they had more integration because it didn't allow one sort of ethnicity to dominate.
So as the Labour Party, what do we want to see? So Nigel Farage has been saying that, and a lot of people from the right in the UK say that all the time. They repeat the fact, they say, the reason why we have a lack of housing, the reason why housing is so expensive and it's so difficult for young people to find housing is because we have too many immigrants. And you don't need to build in our green fields, you don't need to change our neighborhoods, because you should just deport all the immigrants and then there will be enough housing. So do you want to explain to me the economics and the logic of this argument, and does it make any sense?
Well, look, I mean, if we take a step back to the Boris wave, we had about 900,000 net migration. I think it was 1.2 million overall in immigration. And if we're building 200,000 homes a year, we're struggling to get to that. 2.4 households per 2.4 people per household, you could infer about 480,000 people could be housed if we used all of the new supply. That still means that, you've got upwards of another 420,000 people that are adding pressures onto the housing market. So there is some mathematics behind it. Now, if we're looking beyond that, the Labour Party has had, with their plan for change, driven by the economic growth argument. This is advocated by John Van Reenen, that, we need to increase, to get growth, we can do planning reform as part of reducing some of the regulatory burdens. Now, there's been national policy planning framework improvements, introducing mandatory housing targets. We've seen a planning and infrastructure bill sort of streamlining a lot of things. However, there are some risks involved with that, particularly that could scare some of the capital markets, when we know 80% of planning permissions are obtained by non-builders because the regulatory environment doesn't fit the capital markets. Most institutions have a 5 to 7 year horizon. They will only take it with planning permission. There's something called the Building Safety Act, which has put in place a new regulator that Gove introduced. I've written about this in Their Foot Forward recently, which has been decimating the construction industry with more red tape. But to bring it back to your point, the question that isn't answered, I think, by any party is social housing for who? The Labour's put a 1.5 million housing target. They've already been found out recently by the OBR that they're going to miss it, which is disappointing. And there's people that want planning reform to go further. Flexible zoning, builders remedies, density bonuses, low-income housing tax credits, which could get private capital invested, because we're at 100% debt to GDP ratio, which means we cannot keep borrowing money for grant and just funding this housing blob of housing associations. But when we go back to look at Sweden, for example, they had a settlement act. in 2016. And what that meant was any people coming, receiving asylum or being approved for asylum would only have 2 years, after which they were required to find their own, and they did not have recourse to public housing. And, you know, if you do not do that, they might find themselves having to be evicted or may have to relocate. So, and one last point on that, you know, was the fact that over in Denmark, while they had all these parallel society rules being brought in, there's also they have stronger tenants' rights, and they also have anti-discrimination laws around landlords not being able to discriminate, whether it's on ethnicity or on other basis. So, you know, it's still this part of the argument on the left is totally unanswered.
You think the left doesn't have an answer to how do you, or what do you do with social housing and immigration?
Correct. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I do think it's a bit controversial because, on the one hand, it is not easy to get social housing and immigrants don't have recourse to public funds. So a lot of the times we're talking about either people who are actually British because, you know, they are second, third generation, which is, this is the wrong argument to be having. But then do you think that, do you think that there is an argument to be made about social housing and immigration being too high? Talking about first generation immigrants here, not British people who, you know, Nigel Farage or whoever else doesn't want to recognise as British.
Well, look, I think we need to accept the argument that this is where the right's going to go at the end of the day. And, you know, I think the Labour Party with their, you know, irregular routes or illegal immigration I think there's a real deterrent in if you come via an illegal route, you don't get citizenship. We've seen under with Brexit, no deportation agreement put in place. So the Dublin Agreement was removed. The EU-wide resettlement scheme, so going to Turkey and Albania, removed. Left the doors wide open for France to send as many people as they wanted over, and they were just getting rid of their quote-unquote, you know, problem. We've seen the Labour Party make serious steps with putting out an asylum policy that's more humane in line with EU norms. That's allowed relations with France to improve, which has seen, you know, £7 million from Yvette Cooper be put across to help on the other side of the fence, if you like. France have then subsequently changed their laws to allow them to intercept boats, which they previously weren't able to do. And there's also a Dunkirk detention centre, which was announced under Rishi Sunak, but never got built, has now been put as a delivery part of a component, part of an agreement to fund the next, you know, border security command payments over there. So on that side of it, there's good work being done. When it comes to the social housing argument, it's something I think the left has trouble swallowing, is the discussion or debate around immigration. And when we've seen successful centre-left governments, you know, while they're eating the far-right lunch, will be a difficult, painful pill to swallow. It's the only way they've ever maintained power for the last sort of 10 plus years in some of these more democratic, socialist countries. But at the end of the day, the argument around that, percentages of you know, foreign nationals. I live in Tower Hamlets. I chair a party where, you know, 60% or more of the children in our schools are from Bangladesh, and I have lots of friends, people I work with.
Me too, yeah. I went to Queen Mary. Like my first 6 years in London, I was in Tower Hamlets. So lots of my best friends are either from Bangladesh or from Pakistan.
And on the integration argument, there's work by Alice Evans, who's an anthropologist. You know, she's interviewed me previously.
Oh, I love Alice.
Yeah, she's done a lot of work on integration, and some of the discussions that we were having was around, you know, and this is emulated in Sweden's policies that they've had around religious schools. They banned all new religious schools because they found that some types of schools, higher prevalence rates of certain type of schools meant that there was less integration. And the argument around this is something that if the left does not have an answer for, the right will be putting forward policies, and they might be more, you know, uncomfortable than the left is willing to swallow. So reforms policies are moving in that direction. We can see the thought process. I think reforms thinking is low rent in IQ. I do not see them as that clever. You know, the Tories are finding themselves, but we're seeing, you know, large moves by people like Robert Jenrick, you know, hammering this home. And at the minute, it doesn't look like the Labour Party has an answer on the immigration issue wrapped up in housing.
It is difficult because I do think, on the one hand, what I've seen from a lot of people on the left is that they feel very uncomfortable, especially when it comes to social housing, because people like Robert Jenrick will talk about foreign social housing tenants as if they have stolen the place from a British person, especially those who live in central London. And there are a lot of people who will be living in central London in social housing, who will be big families, a lot of them doing really difficult jobs like cleaners and service industry, the most unpleasant jobs that London needs to do to continue moving forward, which a lot of British people wouldn't want to be doing. And they didn't end up there because that was their best option available. That was what was on offer on them. And for me, as an immigrant myself, I completely get how you would feel if you were a middle-class British person working in the city 10 hours a day and you couldn't afford to live in Zone 1, even though you are completely in debt because you had to go to university to get your white-collar job, but you never actually managed to reach a stage where you're able to buy a house and have a family like a normal person and, like everybody expected. But as you say, my worry with the reform-style rhetoric, and Robert Jenrick even going there and framing the problem around housing as a problem about immigration, is that you are missing the actual enemy, which is the fact that we have based our economy on landlords increasing rent and being able to veto new planning developments and just having arcane planning roles and just piling on regulation over regulation over regulation without even having anything positive to show for it. And at the end of the day, you are letting the culprits of this crisis off the hook.
Yeah, well, I'd say, look, there's a considerable amount of problems with our planning system. The bare minimum has been done to sort of reverse a lot of the changes. There are things, you touched on a few points here. The empirical evidence shows that if we have a low supply elasticity, so what does that mean? Allowing developers to respond to price increases. With the arcane nature of our discretionary case-by-case planning system, means that, and the fact that we've only got like less than a third of areas that have local plans are what local authorities and councils, which are politically led, determine what housing should go where. A third of them don't even have one in place. So this leads to what they argue is speculative development, but that's by design. And then people kind of get outraged by that. And then there's this whole planning, consultant industrial complex of planning consultants, planning barristers who make a living out of the frictions in the planning system, plus lobbying agents, right? And they've all got a role to play because of the system that's in place. Now, under the Labour YIMBY, we've been looking at, representative surveys. What are they? So we look to New Zealand, in Auckland, where Jacinda Ardern, the Labour government there, allowed within a station, say 500 metres, up to 6-storey development. What they found was, in 6 years' time, that 20% of all the housing stock was built within that period, with a policy that cost nothing. Labour's got nowhere near that right now. The other issue is when we go back to the social housing argument, and we talk about the civil service blob, right? And we've heard the issues. I think even Keir Starmer has recognised some of these points. Dominic Cummings being one of those that have kind of railed against this the most. Is it costs about 13 billion a year, which is more than the housing budget of 12 billion, by the way. And yet what we have is, if you're going to build an apartment for social rent in London, it costs about £400,000 crudely. The rent level will serve enough debt for about half of that. So our social housing rent will serve about half of that. That's paid for by housing benefit. Housing associations and the housing association blob lobby, they will advocate, we need more money. They're paying themselves hedge fund CEO wages, 300 or 400 grand, right? For services that have had huge increases in severe maladministration, so non-compliance. There's loads of advocates against how these are being managed, right? They will argue for more grant. So the grant is then plugged in for the other 200 grand. That is borrowed from the Treasury over 30, 40 years. The Housing Association borrows against that rent that they get on housing benefit for 30, 40 years. That 200 grand turns into about 500 or 600 grand. So if you add the two together, it's about £1 million to build a social housing apartment when you take the total cost into consideration. So when you have a tax to GDP ratio of 100%, when you have NI being increased, when you have the Henrys, the higher earning, not rich yet, 100 grand cliff, where they will actually be earning less money taking home if they earn more money. These are the most productive people in the economy being disincentivized to work. When you have, farmers having to pay half the inheritance tax, the rest of us have to pay. When you have capital gains tax increasing, when you have all of these things that are being pushed, we had the highest record of public investment in this country since 1972, 22.6 billion into the NHS, police being funded, border security being funded, army being funded. And yes, we've had to do benefit cuts. Yes, we have to look at how do we deal with benefit fraud. The bill's rising. Some of these systems have been in place since 1976 in the benefit system. You don't have departments being able to talk to each other. So when everyone is up against it, after 14 years of neglect, let's be honest, people start asking questions. Where's my money going? Mm-hmm. So, part of the IMBY initiative, they've been advocating for a low-income housing tax credit, and I'll wrap it up on this point here. This is a way in which we can use corporation tax. You can get, in America, they have the low-income housing tax credit, built 3 million homes, bipartisan support, Reagan-era policy born out of a crisis that allowed tax relief to be sold, traded. So what that means is corporations can buy this tax relief. In a mature market in the United States, it's 90 cents in the dollar. If it's a pub math, £10 million, they will get allowed 1 million a year for 10 years. They sell that. So the HMRC, the HM Treasury would allocate to, say, local authorities, the tax credit is what it's known as. The local authorities can have an opportunity area map where they go, right, green, red, blue, deprived area or whatever area, based on whatever conditions they want, to say, if you have land, come bid a tax allocation credit committee with your proposals that meet our conditions, rent levels, green energy, net zero, whatever you want to call it. Private sector can get that too, not just these housing associations. Some are non-profit, some are for-profit. But what it allows is it creates competition, because in the housing association sector, no matter whether they've been allowed to leverage to the hilt, they're still up against it because they've had decent home standards hit them. They've had cladding issues. They've had all these other things where they've just been failing with their existing stock. Their development pipelines are dried up, and the private sector's not been able to do it. But what that means is if you sell that £10 million of a tax relief for £9 million today, you get 2 times economic multiplier. And the supply side policy like that is, for that, you've given away 10 million, but you've got 9 million in today. That turns into 18 million. You net up 8 into the economy. So it's a growth agenda policy. The other thing to note, and this is getting a bit in the weeds, is that 200 grand, say, of gap funding, because the rent will serve the rest of the loan for the rest of it, has a non-cash equity return. So that 200 grand, say, you get 90% of that in, and it's priced in. So there's no paying interest on it for 30 years. It's that 200 grand is actually 90% of it. So there are mechanisms in which should have bipartisan support that can fund social housing, that can be allowed private sector to access this capital to deliver it to. We have build-to-rent developers and other types of developers. SMEs are the largest deliverer of these things in America. So there are new policies to do that. Whether or not they are brought in place in this government remains to be seen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. This was great. Lots to look forward to. Thank you very much.